quick way to think about this notion of value and stakeholders. In my mind, there are three major constituencies when you think about innovation in our space. There's the innovator themselves. That would be you. There is the stakeholder customer, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the next couple of minutes. And then there's the investor. And sometimes I think at Stanford, we focus too much on the investor because we're living in Silicon Valley. And we tend to spend too much time thinking about what appeals to them. Each of these three constituents think about the creation of value very differently. You as the innovator, you obviously need to get paid more for what you're doing than it costs you to make it. And I mean tangible costs and intangible costs. You know what it takes to get something out there and across the finish line. The stakeholder customer isn't in your position. They're really optimizing value. They're trying to find the best way to balance benefit and cost, and they have choices, okay? And the investor, put pretty simply and crassly, is the simplest one. They just want a financial return for a given amount of risk. They're the sort of, in my mind, the least complex and the easiest one to appreciate. These three constituencies interact with what we refer to in the Biodesign program as the stakeholders. And in medtech, as you know from our conversations and orientations and discussions, there are a slew of stakeholders, okay? And we can list these, we can probably list half a dozen more. And they interact with you as the inventor, innovator, and the investors who will sponsor. They will provide capital, okay? They interact around this. You can think of it as an ecosystem around the need through the customer decision maker, okay? Who is ultimately the fuel for the engine, because they provide the revenue which gets this whole thing to work, okay? Ultimately. Real quick, okay, a way to think about what is the innovation constituencies is these three buckets that I've been speaking to. The innovator, that's you. The investors, I've made my comments there in terms of how they fit. And then the stakeholder customer, meaning that's where the real focus is when it comes to talking about stakeholders. If you go to the next one, shipping. And those three constituencies interact with this overarching collection of stakeholders. If you go to the next one, and as I was just saying, there's a broad array of these, and they interact really ultimately focally through the need and the customer decision maker. If you go to the next one. So let me give you a real quick tiny example of the dynamic around stakeholders. This is a proxy needs statement for a project I was involved in many years ago, looking at how might we harvest the saphenous vein in patients undergoing cardiac bypass in a way that would significantly reduce complications from infection. We'll all recognize that as a needs statement. And the objective here is not to wordsmith that, but to understand, working through that needs statement, we started to go into a stakeholder analysis and started asking ourselves the question, well, who's going to care? Who's going to resist? What's the lay of the land? And so if you go to the next slide, what that looked like to us at the time was this, okay? The patient was going to potentially have less leg pain if we could figure out an alternative way to pull that saphenous vein out of their leg. The physician needs were pretty plain and actually plainly presented. They really wanted a good vein to implant, and they were pretty much suspicious of anything that was going to change how they were currently doing it. The payer wasn't real keen on increased costs because there was no reimbursement for this portion of the procedure. There were really no tools being used other than a scalpel, which was being used to slice the leg open to get the vein out. The hospital, it was a profitable procedure, and there just wasn't a lot of back pressure to change anything, honestly, because they were making money. Patients come in, got treated, and went. And then, interestingly, the competitors in the space were predominantly at that time the bypass equipment vendors, who were really the biggest med tech presence in the room. And they saw, people coming in and messing with how cardiac surgery was performed as sort of a threat related to new competition. So if you think about this as kind of what your team might have done as a first pass stakeholder analysis, and then let me show you what it looked like in the end. Go ahead to the next slide, Shakina, if you would. So this is actually kind of more clearly what we encountered. We devised a set of concepts for addressing the need. We sort of started to sort through our alternative approaches, and we ended up learning and discovering that this leg pain and that, frankly, this scar that was being produced in these procedures was a giant concern to the patient. Okay, and pretty much nobody else in the ecosystem. The other stakeholders, the physician, they just wanted a vein, but they also didn't seem like they were going to resist that much because it was a PA, physician's assistant, that was really in charge of that part of the procedure. And as long as they got what they wanted, the clinicians were okay. The payers, they were looking at it going, yeah, we don't want anybody messing around with the cost, but actually, fractionally, any solution that we would come forward with here was going to be small dollars. And so they didn't resist as much as perhaps you might have thought. And the hospitals were somewhat uncomfortable because in the end, our solution that we started to advance required some new equipment, but they were really intrigued by the arguments around infection risk. And the competitors remained the competitors. They were constantly looking over our shoulders and wondering, why they were seeing us in on their turf. And if you go to the next one, this is what the proposed solution looked like. We essentially decided to use what we would think of as laparoscopic techniques to go down and make a cavern around the vein using two sealing trocars on either end, filling that space and extracting the vein. Admittedly, it sounds kind of crazy, right? And by the way, you needed a video tower, which didn't exist then in the cardiac suites, and cameras. And so it was a pretty radical solution. We went out and we did some animal stuff with a scheme of this sort. I can remember the Al Chin, who's you'll cross paths with, was one of the developers of this, and I can remember him coming back with this bag of plastic parts in a baggie, literally, and putting it on my desk and saying, we ought to build this. And I can also remember having a marketing team look at this and decide we absolutely should not build this. And the reason that marketing team came back and sort of, came back with that kind of conclusion was they just felt like the stakeholders, when they looked at it, There was no reimbursement. There was some resistance from the primary clinician in the room. There was sort of, yeah, apparently not, there was not a lot of real proof case data that we could develop to drive adoption. And so we took their recommendation, we built it anyway. And so if you go to the next one. So let me say a couple things about stakeholders in this context. The picture in the book is really, it's something like this, okay? It makes a great diagram, but the real life experience of stakeholders is very dynamic and it doesn't look anything like this, okay? And the reason is these blocks move all around. If you go to the next one, and they change shape and they change relationship to one another, and they do that very dynamically in the course of a program. We started off in the beginning, we had no data on infection rate. We had, logical inference would be that if you could avoid certain sites of surgery, particularly in the groin and the leg, you might have a lower infection rate. It was a plausible argument, but we had no proofs. And in fact, as the marketing team said, we had no compelling reason for change. One of the accidental things that happened was one of the first patients that we did with this procedure was sharing a room with another patient who had their leg cut open. And that turned out to be the single probably most meaningful data, if you will, that we developed early in the history of this product. And the reason was those patients were talking to each other and they were talking to their clinicians. And so as this product kind of became real, what it did was it totally reinforced the patient as the locus of the real strong support for this product. Now, were they the decision maker? No, not necessarily, but they were a real key influence. If you go to the next one. So I want to stop there. I'll come back and make some summary comments on the stakeholder analysis. But the main thing to take away there is that it's not a static kind of, you fill all the boxes and you pick one. It's very, very dynamic. In the years when you have the studies and the data, the stakeholders and your ability to address points of resistance, all of that changes. And so it's important when you're doing these assessments to stay loose about your conclusions in terms of will they be for it or will they be against it. In that particular case, there are several $100 million a year is done with that product that was in the plastic baggie to this day. And it's 15, 20 years ago. So it's become, a very, very significant component of the approach to cardiac surgery. And there's a zillion papers now. Okay, it's a totally different conversation in terms about value and stakeholders. So let's talk quickly about basic market assessment. And we flashed things of this sort in front of you along the way. But a way to think about this in these early stages is that you really are trying to kind of sketch the influences of what creates value. And a way to think about that is in terms of gaps and thresholds and hurdles and crude estimates, kind of sketches of market potential. Where it ultimately ends up is in much more sophisticated segmentation, business model opportunities and nuances, and go-to-market strategies. That's all there, but it stands on a foundation that is usually pretty well delineated by these sketches that you can make. If you go to the next one, please. And so what do I mean by gaps, thresholds, and hurdles? Again, it's about you. You're looking at this, okay? Where are the needs not being met? Okay, that's a gap. That identifies a gap. It doesn't necessarily identify a maximum opportunity to create value. What else is involved? A threshold is involved. How big an improvement is needed to change behavior? If it's just kind of a little shinier and slightly better, We all know that that doesn't move people to change their behavior. You need to be ruthless about these thresholds, okay? And then hurdles is it worth incurring the risks and costs? Yes, behavior might be changed, and who knows, maybe someday this stakeholder who's resistant to this idea can be convinced, but it's going to take a ton of data, 5 randomized clinical trials in 10 years. You have to sort of factor how high is the hill you need to climb in terms of overcoming stakeholder resistance. Next one, please. And so where does that all come down? It comes down to, well, when we go through these filters, as we often term them in the program, we also often think about them in terms of, well, we got to apply the regulatory, we got to apply the reimbursement, we got to look at IP, and in fact, in ranking, you also have to begin to assess what is the relative degree, as you have done with your projects. You've got 20, now you've got 10, now you've got 4, now you're really locking down on 1. How did you get there? You're going through these relative comparisons. A caution is for you to recognize that there's also an absolute comparison, which is the one that sort of says, when all that work is done, have we got what we think we need in order to have something viable enough to ultimately reach the market, reach patients? Please go to the next one. And so you go through literally this process. Is it the best one? Do we understand the risks and costs? Is it worth doing at all? Next one, please. And you can sort of rank these assessments on gaps, hurdles, and thresholds with respect to those sets of criteria that you've spent tons of time in the program on. If you go to the next one, please. Okay, and this one is one where I just would ask you to kind of think about, is the need or solution compelling enough to change behavior? Said another way, or am I wasting my time? How will that be affected by time and market dynamics? Those are the harder questions that require some judgment and some forethought about what the world's going to look like. If you go to the next one. And so you've seen these gap analysis and done these, okay? If you go to the next one. And you have all these signposts out there that guide you toward how to determine whether there's enough of a gap there in order to make it compelling. And if you go to the next one, I'll put us back on time here. So where are the common mistakes? I mean, people in the class have often asked, well, where do you make the mistakes? And I would say it's in here. I'm going to go through 2 or 3 of these real quickly, and then we'll wrap. It's in these areas. When you're identifying these gaps, we can all see a gap. I mean, there's gaps everywhere, okay? Literally everywhere. But sometimes we choose an incorrect customer decision criteria. In other words, we say, well, if this was 15% cheaper as a unit, that would be really meaningful. And we lock in on that set of analysis and say, well, that's the thing, that's what I'm delivering, when in fact it was ease of use or some other component, perhaps in the cost structure. And a second area where we're I think routinely vulnerable is to weak competitive analysis. Part of the problem with our field is you need to project what the world looks like when you get there, because today's world, the way today looks, is not what the world looks like 5 years from now. And in all likelihood, it's going to take you a few years to get a meaningful set of solutions out and into the marketplace. You've got to look at emerging solutions, and you've got to understand what the competitive response will be, because you can look at product X that's being priced at $2,000 a unit until you introduce, and now it's being priced at half that. You've got to factor those things when you project what these gaps look like. Go to the next one, please. If you look at the question of assessing thresholds, we've talked about these signposts and proxies for solution value, and even in new markets, sort of the scale of avoided cost or willingness to pay. It sounds easy, right? And these tools, you've been applying these things. Where do you fall in traps? Next one. The traps look like this, okay? You confuse the user stakeholder with the decision maker, okay? And that's really common. It's really, really common, okay? We tend to kind of target things toward a physician, and in fact, the physician isn't making that decision, okay? And you can have a lot of support from places that don't matter. And so getting to the second level on that stakeholder analysis with regard to that is important. And then sometimes we just because we're innovators, we overestimate the importance of small differences in cost and performance. In other words, we forget everything we learned about meaningful gaps, and we sort of define something as a threshold that just plain isn't going to cut it. We constantly underestimate, in my opinion, switching costs. Everybody's need for whatever it is you're inventing today is satisfied, even if the answer is there's nothing there today. It's satisfied if only because repeating what I did yesterday is easier than changing. And so you have to appreciate that there's resistance in the system just for that. And then sometimes when you do your competitive analysis, we misinterpret reasons for the failure of prior solutions. I'm a big believer that you need to study prior solutions and their failure, but sometimes we rationalize that. We fail to validate directly or properly. You all have spent a lot of time on that to hopefully help you avoid that. Next one, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk real quickly about the hurdles of cost and risk. In an idealized world, picking projects, if you had an amount of ROI on the left and that was large and small and the difficulty hard and easy, which projects would we pick? We would pick the ones that had a large amount of ROI and they were easy, right? We would. I mean, that's what we would do. If you go to the next one. But the world doesn't look that way. It's often subtler, that it's not overwhelmingly clear that it's this binary and this transparent, and things force you to have and apply some judgment to what the stronger project or the stronger proposition is, even measured against a given stakeholder. If you go to the next one. So what are some of the common mistakes that get made in that assessment of difficulty and risk? We lump risk factors together. We say, oh, it's a risky project. What do you mean by risky? Is the risk technical? Is it regulatory? Is it and we have a failure to identify and sequence the key questions. We sort of aggregate risk and instead of disaggregating risk, and we fail to recognize the importance of market dynamics over time, competitive and otherwise. So go to the next one, please. So I said at the outset, the investors were the easiest group to deal with, partly because they're just so simple. They want to make money. Okay, you give me money as an investor, I give you more money back. It's really a simple paradigm. The problem is it's demanding in that you are in an arena when you're innovating where you're taking on a lot of risk, and so people want to make a chunk of money. And these charts and graphs are familiar to many of you, and certainly to those of you at the business school. But the truth of the matter is, this is an overlay that does figure into the calculus of what makes an interesting situation or opportunity. Go to the next one, please. Two summary comments here, and then I'm going to turn it over to the case studies that we've got for you. So what would my summary observations be about market assessment? There's a risk sometimes, I believe, that we think it's a checklist. Well, if it has a high price, if it has a good margin, if it has a, and we checklist overlay onto market assessment. It's not a checklist, okay? It's not an algorithm. And despite how comfortable those notions are to us, in my experience, sometimes the best opportunities that are out there are asymmetrical in the way they present to you. Yes, there's a giant hurdle of a regulatory pathway that hasn't been proven. On the other hand, if we get through that gauntlet, we stand to revolutionize the way we treat patients in a large population in a material way. The fact that when you do the red light, green light analysis on the spreadsheet, that it's red light, has to be viewed in the context of what are the other aspects of the opportunity that may be offsetting. If you go to the next one, please. And so this is my summary slide, and I'll end here. There's really no simple customer in medtech. And it's one of the great riddles, I think, of innovating in the space. That's why stakeholder analysis is so important and difficult in our space. So what is essential? It's essential to at least identify all the stakeholders. In the saphenous vein, story I told you, we were thinking sort of about the patient, but we were primarily thinking when we started about the doctor and the facility. The patient, sort of came out being a lot stronger than we assessed it. And so you want to identify them all because you're not going to be really clear how it's going to shake out until you get there. For a given need, they're just not all equally important. And so, the fact that you identified them at all is great, but you can lose some of their phone numbers over time and it won't matter. And importantly, you got to carry around that their relative importance changes over time. And stakeholder analysis is going to be dynamic, not static. It changes. Okay, so a working vocabulary with it and being attentive to what the market tells you about it is critically important. And then I think this is one that I'm a strong believer in. Too often we bounce off opportunities because we kind of did the assessment, we did the red light, green light, spreadsheet, and we went, too hard, got to change too many red lights into green lights, and we give up, okay? The history of entrepreneurship says that that's not always the best course, and that in fact, okay, you really need to examine the assumptions that underlie the perspectives you take into a project like that, and look for opportunities to change people's, and by people's, I mean stakeholders' perspectives on your project over time.